Thank you to Judy and David for laying it out for us, and Rodney going to the ever faithful M&S to get the sandwiches. I hope you enjoyed them. Thank you. Don't forget your feedback forms. You don't have to start filling them in there, or the handouts and the one for the railway. We've already mentioned, if you haven't paid your donation for the books, Peter's there now with his nice cable jumper on in a rather mottled shade of blue. Our first speaker after lunch, Kathy Chater, you may well have seen her books about. I heard this talk on Coroner's Inquest more years ago than either of us care to remember, which I think was at a Federation conference. So it's very interesting. With the advent of digital newspapers, of course, it's unlocked the way we research, really, isn't it? That you find an accident happen and then go and research it, which tended to happen the other way around. She's various publications. She worked for the BBC, I noticed, and been a freelance researcher, etc. Member of SOG, S-O-G, and Huguenot Society. And her book on researching Huguenots has one of the most clear chapters on the Reformation that I have ever read, which very clearly got all that together for me, and I really understood. I never got around to the rest of the book, but I have it, and it goes to my family history classes regularly. So I'll hand you over to Kathy Chater.
Thanks very much. I don't know about the rest of you, but when I started doing my family history, I didn't bother much about the deaths. I was much, much more interested in the marriages and the baptisms, because you construct your family tree, you can get back really fast. And anyway, I knew they were all dead, so I didn't bother. And then, while doing a course on genealogy, I discovered coroner's inquests and found that they have so much more than how people died. They will tell you how people lived, where they lived, with whom they lived, how they earned their living, how they got on with their family, their friends, their neighbours. And coroner's inquest papers and the reports can give you all sorts of information that you will get from no other official source. So what I'm hoping to do today is to encourage you to look into them. And you also have to remember that it's not just for family history, it's also for local history. If your ancestor lived in a very, very small village, such as the one we're in today, it may have been the most interesting event in the entire year in a rural calendar. And everybody went along, because this, after all, was a real soap opera. This was the real neighbours' lives. So you have to think, did something happen in the village where my ancestors lived that they would have known about, that they would have talked about? I'm going to give you an example. I mean, I'm sure you all know James Woodford's Diary of a Country Parson. He was the vicar of Weston Longville in Norfolk, and he kept a very detailed diary. On the 28th of September 1765, he wrote, "Dr. Clark's cookmaid Mary was this morning found out in concealing a dead child in her box, of which she had delivered herself yesterday morning. Whether she murdered it or not is not yet known, but will be tried by the coroner and jury next Monday." 2 days later, so there was 2 days in which everybody speculated and gave their opinion on it. 2 days later, the coroner, Mr. Norton, with the jury, took inquest this afternoon upon the deceased child, a boy, of Dr. Clark's maid Mary, and brought her in not guilty. Even so, you can imagine how people looked at her after that, how they talked, how that was something of very, very great interest. Now, I'm mainly today going to be talking about the sort of the long 18th century, because this is actually the period when it is most difficult to find out whether an inquest was held or not, but I will be giving you some tips later. Before 1750, quite a lot of these inquest reports are in the National Archives for one reason or another. The government took a much greater interest in the outcome of inquests before the mid-18th century, so there are quite a lot there. And if you want to use the National Archives, a guy called J. Ledley Hotson, in 1925, he tracked down the inquest papers on Christopher Marlowe, you know, the dramatist who died in a brawl in Deptford, or so they came out. And his account of this, which was published in 1925, you can get it online. It's also been republished in a book called The Pleasures of Murder. And that is a really, really exemplary guide to how to pick your way through the National Archives documents. It was, of course, the Public Record Office then, but which ones he approached, which ones he went to, why, and what the results were. So that is quite a good case study in how to use early records. And then, of course, from 1837 onwards, you have death certificates. Now, sometimes if you find a death certificate in your family that's signed not by the registrar but by the coroner, even if it then says natural causes, you will know that an inquest was held. So look at who signs the death certificate. And so, as I say, I'm going to concentrate on the long 18th century. But first of all, just a bit more about modern inquests. The papers will remain with the coroner's office for about 15 years. After 15 years, they can be destroyed if they're not of any kind of interest, whether it's medical interest, legal interest, social interest. But all inquests on a murder must be kept permanently. So may I say to you, may your ancestors die in an interesting manner, because the papers will be preserved. Otherwise, after about 15 years, they are usually passed to the local county record office, but they can be, as I say, destroyed before they are sent there. And then they are closed for 75 years. Now, my grandfather died in 1963. He was in his 80s, he was diabetic, he was in ill health, and he actually, thank you, he fell downstairs. And the shock of it all upset his insulin balance. He went into hospital and he died. And it is the law now that if your doctor has not seen you within 2 weeks before your death, there has to be an inquest. So, of course, this was just massively routine. This was not of any interest at all. I don't think that the papers will have been preserved. I mean, I can't get at them, but the papers won't have been preserved. However, the great source of information, especially in the 20th century, is the local newspaper. They reported the inquest on my grandfather. They summed it all up in one paragraph, And then it must have been such a slow week for news. There was a column and a half about his life, containing things that my grandmother had never thought to mention. She, incidentally, was absolutely devastated that there had to be an inquest, because she thought people would think she'd pushed him, So that's the thing, that they are, and if you want to access them before, within sort of 15 years before they're passed over, and even after that, even after they're in the county record office, you have to actually approach the coroner's court for permission. They're usually well, some of them are okay about it, some of them are difficult. They are especially difficult if they think somebody's going to be sued, or if they think they're going to be, got at for conducting a bad inquest. But that is the current situation with coroner's papers, the modern coroner's papers. Like I said, newspapers are really one of the very, very best sources. And now with the newspaper archive online and accessible through Ancestry and other places, it's a fantastic source of information. There are, however, county newspapers from the mid-18th century. Usually you have a little sort of roundup there of just the inquests, with the verdicts and such like. Proper local newspapers come from the late 19th century. And there is, of course, a Gibson guide on the local newspapers, what newspapers there are and what dates are covered. Now, this is especially important that you consult this because, again, we all think that everything is online now. Not everything by any means is on the British Newspaper Archive. An awful lot of the London newspapers are missing from there, so I think they haven't been put on yet. So it is always worth consulting the directories to see what local newspapers there were, what the dates of it are, and where they are currently stored if you can't access them through the British Newspaper Archive. So that's really worth doing. So now to move on, that's the sort of modern newspapers, and that's how to access modern records. Now to move on, let's look at the actual inquest itself. Who is the coroner and what is his role? Now, the role of the coroner represented the Crown's interests. The old name was the Crowner, and it was a medieval establishment, and the aim at that time was to make sure that the Crown got any money due to it. They investigated deaths to see whether the Crown had an interest in it and could claim money. It's first mentioned in 1194, and it's not an adversarial court. It's to find out what happened rather than to, sort of adjudicate between two competing points of view, although often that's how it winds up. Before 1888, coroners were elected or appointed, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Afterwards, the local authority appointed them. Now, for those of you with Scottish ancestors, I've got some very, very bad news. There are no coroners' courts in Scotland. What you had there, coroners' courts were public. Anybody could go along, and they were reported heavily in the newspapers. However, what happened in Scotland was, if the sheriff court thought that there was, something a bit funny going on, they would go down and make a private investigation and then decide whether any legal proceedings should go on. So a huge number of, sort of deaths in Scotland just slip under the radar. They did later, from 1895, start to hold what they called a fatal accident inquiry, which rather presupposes the outcome of it, doesn't it? But I'm not saying anything. All I'm saying is it is a bit of a problem if you've got Scottish ancestors, simply because the investigation there into what happened was not necessarily made public. Now, the role of the coroner. There are 10 functions were listed in 1829 by a chap called Jarvis, who wrote a handbook for coroners. They are conservators of the peace. They were automatically, by virtue of their office, they are magistrates, so they could initiate other legal proceedings. Second job was to conduct inquests into deaths. The third, to inquire of other felonies like manslaughter, like justifiable homicide, things like that. And the fourth one, this is quite interesting. It goes back to its original medieval function, but it still survives today, and that is to inquire of treasure trove. Here is a chap called Terry Herbert, and he's a metal detectorist, and he discovered over 1,500 pieces of gold in a hoard in Staffordshire. They're currently in Birmingham Museum. They're all, is it 7th century? Sorry, I haven't got my glasses on. Anyway, what happened to determine about this was the South Staffordshire coroner had to hold a coroner's inquiry, an inquest into it, to determine whether the goods had been accidentally lost or whether they'd been hidden with the intention of coming back. Now, if they'd been accidentally lost, it's a case of finders keepers. The owner of the land or the person who finds them is entitled to them. If it was determined that they were concealed with the intention of coming back later, then they become the property of the Crown. Now, nobody loses by accident 1,500 pieces of gold or silver or bullion. So instead, they were claimed for the Crown, but it was valued at £3.3 million. And so far, it is the largest find ever recorded. So bear this in mind when you're looking at your own family history. If an ancestor suddenly becomes unbelievably rich, this may be for a number of reasons. They may have turned highway robber, they may have won the lottery, or they may have found something very valuable on their land. And it's always worth investigating this. There are old reports of coroners, finding things, of sitting inquiries on things that have been found. So it is just one of those things that's worth bearing in mind. So the other things that they had to do, they had to inquire of royal fishes, who are sturgeons or whales, or of shipwrecks. And when I was preparing this talk, somebody I worked with, her father-in-law was a coroner in Berkshire. So I rang him up and said, these royal fishes. And he said, I'll ring you back. And he did ring me back. And in fact, it was one of those things that was swept away in the Victorian era. They looked at them and redid all this. But again, if you live near a river, I don't know what the local river here is, but if you live near a local river and suddenly a sturgeon or a whale swims up, then it was the coroner's job to whiz down and claim it for the Crown. The other thing coroners did, they took appeals of felony, they took the confession of felons, they could deem people to be outlaws. That lasted until 1879, if they just didn't turn up, to give evidence. And they also had to execute process if the sheriff of the county could not. And the last one of theirs was to return inquisitions on a murderer. Until 1977, the coroner's jury could say who they thought had done it. And the last case where the coroner's jury named a murderer was the case of Sandra Rivette. Lord Lucan's nanny? That is the last. Lord Lucan is the last person to have been named as a murderer by the coroner's jury. From 1977 onwards, the jury can now look very, very hard at the person they thought done it, but they may not name him or her. So those are the sort of things that coroners inquired into, that they looked into. As I say, there was a big revision of these things in the mid-19th century, and then 1929 there was another revision of them. Coroners now do not have to have juries, but there are some cases, like murders, where they do. But anyway, I won't talk so much about those because those are modern. Now, I mentioned earlier that jurisdictions, that coroners were either elected or appointed. Before 1888, there were county coroners who were elected for life. They were not permitted to have deputies. And this wasn't usually a problem because there were 2 or 3 covering a county. Yorkshire, being so large, had 3. Where you ran into problems was where there was only 1, because it was a tiny county. In the 18th century, a chap called Purcell was the county coroner from Monmouthshire, and after he was imprisoned for debt, bodies started to stack up. Things got a bit difficult in Monmouthshire, and it was a good time to hide a murder. However, so what had to happen was all the households of the county had to sign a petition to the king. So people were whizzing round, they signed the petition, he came up, and that was it. But they still had to hold another election, a hustings. So this was the problem. Now, privileged jurisdictions are places that for some reason or another have the right to appoint their own coroners. And so various cities have, various boroughs have, some manors had the right, and they could have deputies, which was actually quite common. So it's much better, it was much better run in a privileged jurisdiction. The City of London is the main one. The City of Westminster is another one. And as I say, Gibson Guides, very, very good on newspapers, also very good on coroners' records. There is a Gibson Guide to this published by the Family History Partnership now that lists by county what records survive and where they're located. And what they do in the county as well is they tell you what the privileged jurisdictions were, which ones were privileged, where you would have to go, for example. If I can find my glasses, I will give you an example from, I just happen to have this open here. Let's have a look at Suffolk. So the county of Suffolk has various records here. The Liberty of Bury St Edmunds, this was a privileged city. Lothing Land Half Hundred and Dunwich Borough and Ipswich Borough. Those were also privileged jurisdictions. So they had the right to appoint their own coroners, and they keep their own records separately. They are usually, as I say, now in the County Record Office, but not always. I happen to know that, is it Maidstone in Kent? That was a privileged borough. They've still got theirs in the local history library rather than with the county records. So it's worth bearing this in mind to checking where your ancestor died, whether it was one of these privileged boroughs or if it was in the county. Now, coroners were paid. They had expenses. They were paid by inquest until 1860. And then after 1860, they got a salary. There was a return of coroners. The coroners would return their expenses to the local quarter sessions in order to be paid for this. From 1752 onwards, they got £1 per inquest, and they got an extra 6 and 6 for a murder. There doesn't seem to have been too much sort of cheating to kind of make a bit of extra money. They also got 9p a mile to travel there, but they got nothing for the return journey. And then you will find that there are sometimes other additional expenses. This is later simply because this is readable. This is quite a late one. But you see you've got the sort of the payment to witnesses didn't come in until the mid-19th century, but the removal of the body, the hire of the room to hold it, the expenses for summoning the jury. So you've got all these kind of things. You've got them in the earlier period too, of additional of the expenses. Now, some record offices have separated out the coroner's inquest. London Metropolitan Archives has, for example. Others have simply left them all with the quarter sessions because they were supposed to return their papers to there. And then sometimes the quarter sessions would then pass them on. Before the mid-18th century, they were all supposed to be passed on for the government to consider if anything more needs to be done. So you've got a lot of them, as I say, the earlier period, are now in the National Archives. Incidentally, the National Archives does have a very, very useful online research guide to them that you can download and have a look at. So, as I say, you've got the various kind of expenses. Now, as I say, most of them are in the County Record Office, but some are in the National Archives for various reasons. Various jurisdictions are there. For example, the Duchy of Lancaster, which is Crown property, it's part of the Crown. The Duchy of Lancaster, those coroner's inquests are in the National Archives. There are the various palatinates, Durham, Chester, and things like that. And there's a couple more that, given our talks earlier today, may be of interest. The High Court of Admiralty, for about deaths at sea. Now, I suspect most deaths at sea, they simply tipped them overboard and wrote it in the ship's log, died at sea. However, the High Court of Admiralty had to look into what was called murder and mayhem on the high seas. So if there was a mutiny or somebody was murdered at sea for some reason or another, rather than died accidentally, you may well find that it was covered in the Admiralty. What often happened, especially in the later period, was that the body would be preserved, usually in alcohol of some kind, and I don't know if anybody drank it afterwards, I've never bothered to inquire. But the body was preserved in some way, and an inquest was sometimes held in the first port of call when the ship returned. So again, this may be something for those of you with seafaring ancestors to investigate. But I'm just saying that there are, the High Court of Admiralty does some. And the last one, another one that you may like to have a think about, the Coroner of the Household and Verge. And this is the monarch's household. The verge is the difference of about, I think it's 12 miles around where the monarch had to be at the time, happened to be at the time. This is very much going back to medieval period, you know, of course. But in fact, it still survived to quite late. In the 19th century, I was doing some work on Berkshire, And I found that when Queen Victoria visited Berkshire, and there she was in Windsor Castle, then if somebody died in the town, it was the Queen's coroner who held the inquest. If she wasn't there, she was in Sandringham or somewhere else, then it was the local Berkshire coroner who held the inquest. So this is as an additional sort of problem, but mainly this is for people who were servants of the Queen, or in the case of, you know, Princess Diana, where they held an inquest on her in this country. They didn't do this earlier. This is a 20th century innovation of holding inquests on people who died overseas. It's not, you know, in the 19th century. But the coroner of the household and verge, and those records are in the National Archives. So the next thing that we have to think about is, those are the sort of locations of the records, the jurisdictions. What we have to think about is, how do we know that an inquest was held? There are all sorts of ways that we may know. Now, one of the things I did realise, of course, is, you know, when you look at burial records and you see that it says something like fell accidentally from his horse, that is not up to the clerk to make that kind of decision. Anglican parish registers were legal documents. They could be used later and they held up in court. So the clerk is not going to write by accident there. That is actually an inquest verdict. They were supposed to write buried by coroner's warrant, because the coroner issued a warrant for you to bury the body. But not very many of them do. But you find very often causes of deaths. I was just looking at some of the books over there, for examples, things like drowned. So, you know, yes, of course there would have been an inquest, and it's not simply the clerk telling you that. So that's one of the sort of possible clues that you know an inquest was held. The other thing to have a look at, especially with burial records, is some of you, these don't survive in any great numbers, but day books. The day books were running account books that were kept in parallel, you know, recording the money that came in from having ceremonies done. So if you can find the day books or the church warden's accounts for a period that you're interested in, you may find more information. They haven't survived in any great numbers. Again, because I use London Metropolitan Archives a lot, they have listed them with the parish baptism. So they've got baptism book and the dates, and then they've got day book and the dates for baptisms. You get sort of things like people's addresses, you know, and the marriage and the baptism ones aren't so good. But the burial records can be fantastically useful. And I'll talk again a bit more about how then, but it is worth checking whether there is a day book. As I say, some record offices will put them in parallel with the registers. Not many do. A lot of them, it's just kind of miscellaneous. And how many of us actually check all the miscellaneous? We don't, do we? You should. You need to have a look. As I say, they haven't survived in any great number, but the account books, the day books, can tell you additional information. And here's just a bit of general advice. Make a list of all the deaths in your family. It doesn't matter who they are. Make a list of all the deaths, and then have a look at newspapers for a couple of weeks later to see if an inquest was held. And then you will know that it may be worth following up to see where the coroner's records have survived and where they are. But it is worth doing that, because even if it was if it was just somebody's aunt, your ancestor's aunt, it's worth investigating that, because your ancestor may have been giving evidence, may have been telling you something about his situation that you wouldn't know from anything else. So it is worth doing that, of making a list of all the deaths in your family. And because it's so easy now, just running it through the newspaper reports to see what happened. So now we come on to the inquest itself, and you may have ancestors who were involved in a number of ways. Here we have an inquest. Most inquests are held in inns. And so those of you, and which of us has an innkeeper in their ancestry, bet you anything that an inquest was held at some stage in their pub. And they took money for, everybody turned up to have a drink and, listen in and all the rest. So it's worth having a look, as I say, to see the innkeeper. This is the coroner, and this is his clerk, who wrote down all the evidence. Here is the jury. Here is the onlookers who have just come along to, to rubberneck, to gawk. Here is one small and terrified witness, and here is the beadle. And the beadle's job was to summon the witnesses and to make sure that they attended. So those are the people who are involved, and your ancestors may have been among them. Now, as I say, most of them were held in pubs. The Hare and Hounds Inn, which is in Briarcliff in Lancashire, was just the local place where they always held the inquests. Coroners' courts were actually quite late on, Of course, some were held in hospitals and the like, but generally the inn was the only place that was large enough to take everybody involved. And in 1644, the rumour is that 5 men were killed in a skirmish during the Civil War, and the bodies were put in the cellar to await the coroner because it was reasonably cool down there. I just think that's just brilliant, that the Civil War's going on, but they're still going to have an inquest.
One of those was one of my family.
Oh, good, yeah. Okay, so as I say, they went on holding inquests there because that was the nearest, large place. However, some publicans were a bit more difficult about this. In 1836, a publican refused to allow an inquest to be held in his inn, the King's Arms, in Hounslow, West London, without payment. The coroner was extremely irritated that the parish refused to cough up the expense for this. Then he drew himself up. Then all I can say is that the parochial officers of Heston Parish are a mean, pitiable set, and I will speak of their conduct wherever they go. I have filled the office of coroner above 20 years and was never so disrespectfully treated. He was really peeved. They had to actually hold it in the shop, where it was a shopkeeper's wife, where she had died, with the body in the corner and everybody else squashed into a tiny, tiny room. Not a lot of fun. So, as I say, the beadle summoned the jury, and this is his. He was given a warrant to do this. Most of this is from the City of London, because the records there are brilliant. They're also, incidentally, a lot of the London inquests are now coming online on the London Lives website, worth checking out. But you see, you've got here, he has given a warrant to the beadle to go and summon the jurors. What happened was the coroner made a list of potential jurors and then handed it to the beadle with the warrant, and he went out to look for them. And the warrant, here's another list here, where the the beadle has marked who could attend and who couldn't. I think Weedon Southwell Beadle is just such a brilliant title. I don't know why Dickens never used it. Anyway, what you do find again, and he's also put all the witnesses there on here, this is why I chose this, but some of the lists in the City of London include things like wife says not in, gone away, The problem is that the jurors were by and large, they were usually lower middle class tradesmen, and it was a great nuisance to attend. They might have to shut down their business, so they would lose money. They weren't paid expenses until 1837 for attendance. And what you do find again in the City of London is that they would quite often pay substitutes to go in for them. They'd go down to the workhouse and get some old boy to come along, and the going rate in the early 19th century was 2 and 6. Half a crown, for those of you who remember old money. And there was an enormous fuss at one quite important inquest where they found that half the jury was old men from the workhouse and most of them were deaf. So there was an enormous fuss about this, which is only how I know all about this, Anyway, they had to be, here they are, all the jurors had to sign the verdict. But it had to be a majority verdict, and at least 12 of them had to agree. So you could actually, and if you wanted to be on the safe side, you would summon up to 24 jurors and then get a majority verdict. That again is the exception to the sort of the rule for other court cases. But you do find, I mean, I've cut the thing off here. There was all the details of the death and all the rest of it, but just to show you that they all signed it. So that's something that you might investigate, whether your ancestor was on a jury. And it also was not just the loss of business. Until 1926, they actually had to view the body with the coroner, or it was not a legal inquest. Now, the problem about this was that, in fact, before the development of forensic science and the police force in the mid-19th century, it was actually the jurors who were supposed to examine the body, you know. There's another diary that you may know, Thomas Turner, the diary of a village shopkeeper in East Hoathly in Sussex. In July 1756, he was called to an inquest. So he met a load of people and he went to Lewes about 6:20 in the morning. And then he did a bit of business, paying people and all the rest of it. And then we came up to Mr. Porter's about 10 o'clock, where we went in and stayed the time of eating a bit of bread and drinking a glass of wine. We came up to my house, where we provided ourselves with all things necessary for the operation, to wit, a bottle of wine and another of brandy, and aprons and napkins, together with a quantity of fragrant herbs, such as mint, savoury, marjoram, balm, pennyroyal, roses, etc., and we threaded all the needles. They actually attended the inquest. So you can see it wasn't just a loss of business. If you had a slightly more sensitive ancestor, then they might not have wanted to go through all this, especially if it was a nasty accident, you know. Anyway, so those are the jurors. Other places where it was seen as an advantage if they knew the deceased and the witnesses. They played, as the reports of inquest show, a very, very active part. They questioned people, they argued with the coroner, they told him what they thought, and very often you see that they came to a decision among themselves based on what they knew, because they knew the person. It was seen as an advantage, which was in contradiction to, for example, the sort of the medical evidence. There is one case where the verdict was that the man had died of cold and exposure, but the jurors who knew him and said he was really weird said that he'd taken poison. And that was the verdict that went down. So, you know, they rarely retired to consider their verdict. An earlier writer of a handbook for coroners, a chap called Umfraville, in 1761 said that if the jury wanted to retire to consider their verdict, you are by no means to terrify or threaten them. I'm thinking, what are they doing? But readily permit it. Nor are you to suffer anybody to interfere or interrupt them. They must be alone. However, Umfraville hinted, if you wanted them to come to a fast decision, you could keep them without meat, drink or fire. So I mentioned earlier that the innkeeper's premises is another one. And then, of course, there were all the people who attended the inquest as witnesses of one kind or another. The first one was always the doctor. So again, if your ancestor was a doctor in a local place, especially if, for example, he was in a garrison town, because the combination of young men and alcohol and weapons is a potent one. There's a chap in Hounslow, I don't know when he saw the barracks at Hounslow, I don't know when he saw his patients, he always seemed to be going to inquests. But anyway, so you had the doctor who, first of all, had to say that the person was actually dead, you know, and then give his opinion. Here we are. A coroner's inquest. Juror, the man's alive, sir, for he has opened one eye. Coroner, sir, the doctor declared him dead 2 hours since, and he must remain dead, sir, so I shall proceed with the inquest. So, as I say, you will always have the doctor. Other witnesses are, of course, the nurses in hospital, parish officials in the workhouse, all sorts of people, even just passers-by, you know, gave evidence about this. But it is especially useful where, you know, family members are called, and they do give you a huge amount of information about, you know, family relationships. Now, having heard the witness statements, do not often survive. These are quite, these tend to go. But newspaper inquests, and I have been able to compare, in some cases, the actual statements in the Record Office with what was reported in the newspapers. And they do seem to be very, very congruent. The newspapers, journalists did have shorthand in those days. And so I think that we can reasonably rely on the report of what witnesses said. We can't always rely, and this is true of newspapers today, on what the journalists asked people outside the courtroom. But if you have a look through them, this one is from Newgate Jail. David Ross, a prisoner for debt in the jail of Newgate, and he just leaves, testimony about a fellow prisoner who died. So that's, again, a witness deposition that is worth having a look at. Now, having heard all the witnesses, the jury had to come to a verdict, an agreed verdict, on how the person met their death. And these are the various possibilities. Visitation of God is one you might encounter. This is a sudden death, in fact. And I do think, and it's either sudden death, sometimes by natural causes, or which does seem to be a natural, disease or something like cancer. Visitation of God seems to be mainly for sudden deaths. What today, when you look at it, we would call a stroke or a heart attack, where someone just drops dead in the street. That tends to be visitation of God. It tends to be visitation of God by natural causes, also tends to be much more for a long-term illness, TB or cancer or whatever. And natural causes, natural death, as we say, that's quite easy. Oh, sorry. The next one, which is quite useful, and this is where things get a bit difficult for the jurors. If we see here, this woman is falling to her death. It's the Thames, that's St Paul's there. And there are all these witnesses, and there is the chap who's going to rush forward, with his boat, and he may or he may not save her. If she drowns, what are the possible verdicts? She might have fallen from the bridge, in which case it's an accidental death. She might have been pushed, so that might be manslaughter, or that might be murder. Or maybe she jumped, and that's suicide. So these are actually verdicts where what the outcome of what the jurors decided was actually quite important. And I do a whole separate talk about suicide, so I'm not going to go into it in enormous detail, but it is, one of the major problems that jurors had. So it could have been, as I say, accidental death. She could have fallen. Murder, manslaughter, justifiable homicide. Was she attacking someone who pushed her to save his life? And then that's justifiable homicide. If a soldier shoots a rioter, that's justifiable homicide. So these are the possible things there. And then suicide. After that, the jurors had to decide whether the person was insane at the time, they did not know what they were doing, or whether it was what's called felo de se, a murder of yourself, that you knew what you were doing and you killed yourself deliberately. There were lots of ramifications about this. Again, as I say, I do a whole lecture on this, and I've only got about 4 minutes, so I'm just going to whiz through this at the moment. The point being, if you were found to be insane, you could have a Christian burial, and you would be buried in the churchyard, and it wouldn't be a problem. If you were a felo de se, a self-murderer, until 1823, you could not be buried in the churchyard, or at least you weren't buried in the churchyard. You were usually buried at a crossroads with a stake through your body. And the aim of that, which is, predates Christianity, was to anchor the unquiet spirit to the earth, to stop it rising and haunting the living. And the aim of the crossroads was that if the spirit did manage to escape, it would get stuck there. It wouldn't know which way to go. There's a thought next time you're waiting for the traffic lights to change, eh? But you see, the fact that the jurors usually knew the deceased, And they often use the fellow de se verdict as a way of criticising them, of criticising their behaviour. So if you've got a suicide verdict, you've got various things to weigh up there. There's a great one here. I've got to put this onto the here at the moment. The Oldham Chronicle reports the death of a vicar, a local vicar. The jury returned the verdict that he was possessed of an evil spirit. They did not like that man, you know. That, as far as I know, is a unique verdict. But here we are, possessed of an evil spirit, vicar's cruelty to his wife and children, Leesfield tragedy, shocking revelations at the adjourned inquest. Anyway, the reason that that's in the National Archives, and there's a whole report on it, is because that people protested. That, you know, a vicar, a man of God, that the jury came to the verdict that he died, he killed himself because he was possessed of an evil spirit. I mean, you can see where people were really annoyed about this. So that's why, and that again, as I say, wound up in the National Archives. Other verdicts you might find are one of the necessaries of life, that's starvation. That's some poor person, or an anorexic, actually. You know, you do find this. This wasn't necessarily recognised as an early thing, but you do find young girls starving themselves to death. Inclemency of the weather is exposure. Your ancestor was riding home one market night. He, you know, the horse stumbled. He was thrown off, you know, thrown into the heather and died of cold. And then you often find an open, or what's called a narrative verdict, an open verdict found drowned. The whole aim of this is not to prejudice any future proceedings, you know, the whole double jeopardy thing, that if someone was found not to have murdered a person, you know, they would leave an open verdict, so if later on more evidence came to light, it could be reopened. So found drowned. And there's also a narrative verdict. My very, very favourite one, it's a case again in North London. And this man died of poison. And the jurors returned a verdict that he died of an ingestion of poison, but how or by whom administered does not appear to the jurors. And I read the case on this, and it went on for days, you know, the whole court, the whole inquest. And it's either the wife or the son who done it, but whoever done it, they got away with it. So that was the point, that a narrative verdict of just recounting what happened. So I think what I've got next is, sorry, I've got some papers here that I was using for another talk, but I haven't got time to do them now. So a quick gallop through this. Finding records. Make sure that you know where the person died, not where they lived. So if it's near a county border, check both sides of the county border. Note by whose jurisdiction it was, and look at the Gibson Guide for that to see which jurisdiction it was, so where the records are held. And remember things like hospitals and workhouses. Although they won't have the inquest papers there, they may well be in their minutes notes about what happened, especially if there was criticism of the staff. So it's worth following these up, you know, in hospital or workhouse or public institutions. And again, in the National Archives, the goods of fellow de se suicides were supposed to be forfeit to the Crown, but very often people would submit petitions asking that not to, you know, take all the deceased person's good. So have a look at that kind of thing. It ended in 1871. Have a look at the, you know, other documents, quarter sessions, church wardens' accounts and all the rest of it to see if you can find out any more. And also you can find things like post-mortem papers, the doctor's reports. The Wellcome Institute, for some reason, has not unnaturally got a huge kind of file of them on there. So it's worth having a look at that. And I would just wind up now with a reminder of the kind of information that you can get from an inquest report that you can get from no other official record. And this is a suicide in January 1840 in London of a man, a tailor, aged 70, who lived in number 23 in the Strand, and his wife said that on Friday last, the deceased, who was her husband, completed his 70th year. He appeared very miserable during the whole of his birthday and retired to bed in the same state of mind. The next morning, about 6 o'clock, she got up and found him dead and hanging from a door. And they had all the evidence of this. And it turned out that this is the gain of interest to family historians, that they lived in the same house as his brother and his nephew. So there was a whole family in the house. And the nephew reported, "My uncle drank hard, but his wife drank harder. He drank because she did, and because she made his home very uncomfortable, lying abed of a morning and not getting him his breakfast. She spent every farthing she could lay hands on in drink, and there was a drawer full of duplicates from pawnbrokers for things pledged in order to procure gin." And then the brother, who also lived in the house, gave evidence. "If," said one of the brothers, "he had followed my example and become a total abstinence man, this would not have happened. Sobriety would not have depressed his mind. It would have enabled him to support the most intolerable of all miseries, matrimonial ones. Drink has been his ruin, as it has been and will be the ruin of thousands. Verdict, temporary insanity." You can see what a home life that poor man had, but you would get no other detail of that from any other record. So I do encourage you to discover coroner's inquests. Thank you very much.
There we are. So many opportunities to find out more about our domestic situations of our ancestors. Has anybody got any questions, please? Again.
Oh, dying for a comfort, thank you.
Gentlemen, are you? Are we all right with this one? Right, gentleman at the back, please.
Thank you for that. My grandmother committed suicide in about the end of the 1930s, early 1940s.
Yeah.
So because of the 75-year rule, does that mean her inquest is probably accessible if it still exists?
If it still exists, yeah. Okay, your first thing is to find out whether the papers have survived. They are almost certainly in the County Record Office. Do you know where she died?
Yeah, she died in West Bromwich, so I think they're in Stab.
In where?
In West Bromwich she died.
Okay, fine. So you're going to have to check the... Is it Warwickshire?
It's Staffordshire. So
well,
I think they're in... Stourbridge, actually.
We'll have a look at coroner's records to make sure that it's in a sort of special place and where they are. They will almost certainly be in the Staffordshire County Record Office. So the first thing to see is if it's survived there, and then if it's still within 75 years, and they're quite careful about this. Not every record office is, and since this is being recorded, I'm not naming names. Some of them will just let you go in there and have a look, but check with them. If not, then you have to get permission from the current coroner's office, and I can't see any great problems with that, but I'm just telling you that's the sort of procedure. Have you had a look at the local papers, of course?
No, I haven't.
Well, I think have a look at the local papers as well, and that will give you a bit more information. But if you want to access the papers, that's the sort of basic way to do that.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Anybody?
Thanks very much, Kathy. That was really fascinating. This isn't so much a question, just as a point of interest. I don't know whether people are aware of the work that's been done by Stephen Gunn from Merton College, Oxford. He's had a big project funded by the Economic and Social Research Council looking at coroner's inquests for the 16th century.
Yeah.
He's done a tremendous amount of work in transcribing. It's not the complete run for 16th century, but I think he's got 3 decade-long runs where he's transcribed, he and a research fellow have transcribed everything there. At the moment, that isn't available publicly, but it will be. I think once they publish the book, off the back of the project, that will become available, so that may be a great interest to people in the future.
And sorry, just on the subject here, I've just seen that there's various places are doing sort of local transcriptions, things like Oxfordshire, Suffolk, the various sort of places on the Kent coast. And so, again, I know you mentioned that there are indexing projects available, but you need to have a look at your own local archives and see if there's a little indexing project in there that any of you could do.
Any more questions? You're off. I'm on there. Well, good there. That's better. Well, I can't say I remember all that detail from all those years ago, and I'm sure they've changed in some respect. But again, going back to newspapers, how they opened the door of the potential to find out such personal details. So I'm delighted to have refreshed my memory and learnt an awful lot more. You might have thought it was a simple topic, but there's a lot of detail, and jurisdictions are always a helpful clue. So do get your Gibson guide. Those of you coming to the conference, hang on, there will be a discount voucher in the packs to that. But can we, for now, say a big thank you to Kathy for this afternoon's talk. Right, we have another